We are continuing on in this series, Jesus on Justice, and it's our summer-long series, Living Lives of Conviction and Compassion. What does it mean to have both conviction and compassion as we look at the world that is before us, that Christ has called us to live in and amongst people? And today we're looking at the risking of our reputation and how Jesus risked his reputation, and what does that mean for you and I? And so as we continue in this dialogue, we find ourselves living in amidst those who are marginalized, those who find themselves at different places in their lives, sidelined, or not in a place where we are at. And that's a bit of a challenge for us as we consider this series, because it's not about being us against them. I must confess that it's easy for to acknowledge that there are people with needs. I think none of us would have any challenge with that. We know that there are people in this world who are in need of help. And there is a varying degree of willingness on our part, for the most part, to get involved with those who do need that measure of help. No one is ever, most of us sitting here today would not say, I don't want to help anybody. I'm not, let them take care of themselves. That's not what most of us are at. There's a willingness to participate in the lives and to facilitate some measure of change today. But I got to be honest with you, and if you're honest with yourself, isn't there a limit? I mean, there is a limit, isn't there? I mean, isn't there that place where you'd go, No, that's not for me. That's too much. I mean, there are people in this world that really get involved, but that's not what God's calling me to do. I mean, I want to help, but at what risk? Forgive me, there's no handout here today because I really didn't want you to learn something today. If you're here with your learning cap on, please take it off. Today is not about learning. Today is about getting. I want you to receive something today. I want to speak to your heart today, not your head. I mean, it's one thing to help the poor and the disenfranchised, but at what cost to us? At what place do you back away and say, sorry, this is as far as I go? Pastor Tim talked last week about the Good Samaritan and his willingness to get involved in the life of that person who had been beaten up and left for dead on the side of the road. Where do you say, I'm not going to do that? When do you start to ask the questions, well, what will people think of me? What will they say about me if they see me there or see me at this place? I mean, I have reputation. What about my children? Do I want my children involved? What if it has a negative effect upon my children or my family? Or what about my business? I'm a particular kind of businessman here in the town, and there's a way in which I am perceived. Reputation is what you are known for, what people associate or think of when they say your name. On three, I want you to say your name nice and loud. 1, 2, 3. What do people think when they hear your name? By definition, it's the estimation, if you would. Reputation is about estimating. The estimation in which a person is held, especially by the community. How does the community hold or estimate you? A person has got a good reputation. There's the estimation, if you would, of that individual. To have your name recognized, to standing for some form of merit or achievement or a measure of reliability. We say, well, you can count on this person. When you say their name, oh, absolutely. That reputations can be built up or torn down, depending on a behavior. And that in that estimation, there is a prediction, if you would, as to how someone will act or react in any given situation. So we find ourselves, when something happens, we'll say, wait till they find out. They're going to blow their lid. They're going to flip. They'll be so upset. Or, oh, I can't wait for them to find this out. Boy, they'll be so shocked. What about yours? When things happen, what are you known for? Are you proud of your reputation? Are you known as someone who steps up to the plate? Can people count on you? Do you put yourself out there? As we consider this series on social justice and the actions or the instructions of Jesus, what Jesus' reputation was, and that his reputation is supposed to be reflected in our reputation. That is, we will often say in the church, when you see an individual, do you see Jesus? In other words, what we're saying is the estimation of your character should be a reproduction, if you would, or a facsimile of the person of Christ. Are you known for indifference? Are you just a big windbag? Or humbled service? Are you known for awkwardness or judgment or condemnation? Would people expect or anticipate that when something comes up that you'll be the one to first get involved? Or are you the one who's going to judge everything? Are you the one who's always running around spouting off about how bad the world is, but not really doing anything to make it better? So if you could change some things about your life, what would you change? Would you change the way you see yourself, or would you change the way others see you? Is it more about what you see in the mirror, or are you more concerned about what others see? When you look around at your world and your environment, do you consider yourself poor or rich? Are you socially in or socially out? Do you consider yourself spiritually mature or immature? Are you winning or losing? Are you succeeding or failing? When you estimate your circumstances, would you change them, or would you change your attitude towards them? Would you change the amount of money you have, or would you change your contentedness about what you don't have? Would you change the way people treat you? Would you change the way you treat people? If you could change something about your life, what would you change? People's estimation of you? Or do you really not care at all? I don't care what anybody thinks of me. I am what I am. Take a few minutes and talk amongst your friends and those you've come in with today. And let's have a little bit of a chat as to whether or not we really care of what people think or where we're at. We'll be back in just a minute. So, what was the consensus? When I was, growing up in the church, hearing what it means to be a Christian. Now 25 years preaching and teaching about what it means to be a Christian. In our everyday lives, we understand about our need for God, and we begin the gospel message with the notion that man has a need of a Savior, a need of forgiveness. And that when we recognize our need for forgiveness, that we accept what Christ has done on the cross, and out of that, we are to produce lives of both holiness and purity. And therein lies the quest of what it means to be a successful Christian, to be pleasing in the eyes of God, that the way in which we measure our Christian faith, if you would, is holiness and purity, that it's about what I do or what I don't do and how I live my life. And we often make our salvation a very personal thing, and I'm not saying that it's not, but we internalize our salvation in terms of our duty or our response or our practice or our faith by a measure of holiness and purity in that which we do or don't do, that it's about actions. So that I'm not supposed to lust. I'm supposed to be true to my wife, and I'm not supposed to lie, and I'm not supposed to cheat, and I'm not supposed to steal, and I'm supposed to be good, and I'm supposed to have the fruit of the Spirit of love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, action, meekness, all of these things. And if I do these things, and if I don't do those things, then I'm producing a life of purity and holiness, that the measure, if you would, of my faith is about what I do as who I am. And yet, is there not more? And that's really the essence of this series, this whole discussion on social justice, that Jesus perhaps is wanting us to define what it means to be a follower of Christ with something more than just a measure of holiness being a series of do's and don'ts. That perhaps holiness and purity is more than just doing all the right things and not doing all the wrong things. That faith, true faith, requires compassion. It requires courage. Perhaps what our faith is more about being weighed and measured by the way in which we treat others. Maybe holiness and purity is not so much about what we are on the inside, but rather the way in which we act with our community. How do we respond to others who are not like us? And I'm always careful when I say that, and please allow me this liberty to talk like this, because I'm moving us from here to there. So we have to start at the here. And the here is that we look at where we are at, and then we look at where everybody else is at. And so they who are not like us, the call for us as a Christian is to help them become like us. So those who are sinners, we want them to be saved. Those who are unrighteous, we want them to be righteous. Those who are not on God's side, we want them to be on God's side. Those who perhaps in the social world, those who are poor, we want them to become less poor. Those who are hungry, we want them to be satisfied. Those who are naked, we want them to be clothed. Those who have no home, we want them to have a house. Those who have what we don't have, we want them to have, well, not quite as much as what we have, but a portion of it anyways. Faith requires courage. It requires us to step out and to act on what we believe and to do what Jesus did. We talk about measuring sometimes what would Jesus have done? And is it okay to do what Jesus would have done if it makes us feel awkward or uncomfortable? Is that okay? Needing courage implies what? It implies that we are in danger or we are risking something, that there is something that's in jeopardy, that there is some sort of potential loss or cost involved. Courage is something that seems to be reserved these days for dangerous activities like soldiers or police officers or firemen. We want them to be courageous for us. But when it comes to social justice, where and when do I need the courage? Where and when does the measure of my Christian faith cause me to risk my reputation and to step out and to do something that is courageous, that may cost me something? So let me just ask for some quick responses. When it comes to courage and our own reputation, what are some scenarios that you would perhaps encounter? When is it that our Christianity costs us some courage in the risking of our reputation? What would be a scenario where you would find yourself going, Anybody? Yeah. Confession to others. Absolutely. There always comes a great courage that is required when we step out and we acknowledge things that have happened in our own lives that we're willing to confess to others. So absolutely. Anyone else? Where is that when courage is required? Sharing our faith. Absolutely. Sharing our faith. And being willing to stand up when we were talking about this in the first service in business or commerce or in work environments, when somebody goes on and on and on about maybe questions they would have, and us having the courage to say, well, but I actually believe that God has a role to play in your life. When was the last time you shared your faith? When was the last time you ever opened your mouth and told somebody about Jesus?
Talking to non-believers about homosexuality.
hot buttons, talking to unbelievers or people that are not, again, hold me now on this, people that are not like us and talking to people who are not like us. She used the example of homosexuality. How do you have the courage to speak up on those hot buttons? Homosexuality, this is Gay Pride weekend here in London, abortion, some of those other, when would we have the courage to say in a way that doesn't offend, okay? And say, well, you know what, I believe something that's different, even though you may reject what it is that I believe. Anyone else? Yeah, way at the back. Norm, yell it out. Sure, putting out fires at work requires great courage sometimes. Yes?
You are a person who's shouting and no way of getting out, talking to people, but when they come into your home, you share the gospel, you show them how you live, and they have a change.
Yes, absolutely. If you're a shut-in or if you are in your own home, I know that one of the challenges that I've always had when it comes to caring for those who are hurting or those who are going through some perhaps difficult times, especially in the area of social justice. At Christmas time, we're always invited to give, and people give more at Christmas time than any other time of the year. And every time I consider what it is that we would give in terms of food or goods or finances or whatever, I have often heard the voice of God say, are you just as willing, instead of giving the food to the poor, why don't you invite the poor into your own home and feed them there and spend an actual evening with them? That would require courage. The question is, what kind of life am I living? And whether it's characterized more by safety or by danger, by courage or by cowardice. We gave you a bunch of books to read over the course of the summer months that you can pick up, and I trust that we've gone through quite a few of them, so I know that many of you are reading. One great book by Shane Claiborne, phenomenal writer. Don't read it, it's pretty dangerous stuff. Entitled The Irresistible Revolution. Just when he talks about this whole topic, I want to read for you just a couple of pages here. He says I'm not sure where we get the notion that Christianity is safe or that Christians should play it cool. Growing up, I always thought that Christians were good, upstanding citizens, but the more I get to know Jesus, the more trouble he seems to get me into. Søren Kierkegaard puts it this way: to want to admire instead of follow Christ is not an invention of bad people. No. It's more an invention of those who are spinelessly wanting to keep themselves detached at a safe distance from Jesus. Some Christians take so few risks, it's no wonder that folks have a hard time believing that there is even a heaven to go to. Most of us live in such fear of death that it's as if no one really believes in the resurrection anymore. Sometimes people ask me if I'm scared when I live in the inner city. I usually reply that I'm more scared of living in the suburbs. The scriptures say that we should not fear those things which can destroy the body, but we are to fear those things that can destroy the soul. While the ghettos may have their share of violence and crime, the suburbs are the home of the more subtle demonic forces in this world. Numbness, complacency, comfort. It are these things that eats away at our soul. My dear mother, bless her heart, has some things to say about safety. Again, I'm just her child, so there's a lot at stake for her. But she has watched me go to jail. She's watched me travel to Iraq. Evidently, even though the hand of God has been with my life, my mom has learned a lot about faith and safety and risk. And it's not been easy, but she recently said to me, I have come to see that we Christians are not called to safety, but we are promised that God will be with us when we are in danger. And there's no better place to be than in the hands of God. Perhaps the most dangerous place for a Christian is to be in safety and in comfort. He goes on to write this. In his book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, C.S. Lewis portrays this dangerous encounter with the God that should make us all shiver. Lucy is about to meet Aslan the lion, and she asks, Is he a man? Aslan, a man, said Mr. Beaver. Certainly not. I tell you that he is king of the wood and son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is king of the beasts? Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. "That you will, dearie, and make no mistake," said Mrs. Beaver. "If there's anyone who can appear before Oslin without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or just plain silly." "Then he isn't safe," said Lucy. "Safe?" said Mr. Beaver. "Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver is telling you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe. But he's good. He is the king, I tell you." "That's the God that I've come to know," he writes. "A God who is not safe, but a God who is good." If the kind of life that we live as a follower of Jesus Christ, if it's not one that is potentially dangerous for me, if it's not one that involves risks, one that requires courage in order to live it out, is it possible that I have created my own version of Christianity? And is it possible that the version of Christianity that you and I have created in our own mind and our own hearts is not the version that Christ has called us to? If my life does not require courage, then maybe the safety that I value, the comfort that I value, the convenience that I value is not the values that Christ has called us to in the first place. Being salt and light. Being moved with compassion to the sick, the hurt, and the wounded of this world. It's a call to courage because it results in a life that is characterized by discomfort and inconvenience and cost and risk and danger, and it might even cost our reputation. The question is, do we dare pursue a life like that? Do we dare do what God calls us to do? They're big questions. But I either believe that we ask and we answer them now here on this side of eternity, or later we will be asked of them by God himself, and then we will answer. The reality is sometimes I care more about what someone thinks about me than I care about what God thinks about me. Sometimes I'm more concerned with my own comfort than I am the comforter serving others. I'm more interested in filling my life with food and relationships and entertainment and having good times. I'm more interested about my reputation being respected than I am about a person's salvation and whether or not I'm accepted for who I am, a follower of Christ. Can anybody relate to me on this? Tell me I'm not here alone. Remember, reputations cannot die for us. Our popularity, our people's acceptance of us cannot die for us. Our money doesn't die for us. Our theology cannot die for us. Even our families, though they love us so much, they don't die for us. Jesus dies for us. Anthony Duzz wrote a blog recently, and he said, Jesus does not tell us to love sinners. They say that Jesus was a friend of sinners, but Jesus never describes himself as that. His motto was not, eating and drinking with prostitutes. Those were labels of the religious community, those who were disapproving of him. What's amazing about Jesus is that he hung out with sinners, but he didn't act like they were sinners. They were just his friends. They were people with names and faces and dreams and hopes and feelings. They were people like you and I, destined by God's plans, not defined by their sins. Some of them were hurt. Some of them were wounded. Some of them were messed up by failure, by their own poor choices, marginalized by evil's intentions. Yes, but Jesus called them friends. It was the Pharisees that scrawled sinner on their foreheads. It was the accusers who drew circles in the sand with themselves on the inside and those sinners on the outside. Jesus never told us to love sinners. He told us to love our neighbor. He told us to love people, period. And he never called us to weigh or to measure or to assess or to cherry pick those who are worthy or unworthy of our love or our compassion. He never called us to look at their lives and say, no, we should help them. But no, we should not help them. Let me end with this story. One of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, and he went to the Pharisee's house and he reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. And as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. She wiped them with her hair, and she kissed him, and then poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who invited him in saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who's touching him and what kind of a woman that she is. She's a sinner. Jesus looked at him and said, Simon, I've got something to tell you. Well, tell me, he said. I'm going to tell you a story. He said 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii, the other owed him 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he decided to forgive the debts of both. Now, the question, Simon, is this: which of them will love him more? Simon looked at Jesus and said, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt. Jesus said, you have judged correctly. Then he turned to the woman and he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came to your house. You didn't give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time that I've entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put any oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on me. Therefore I tell you, her sins, though they have been many, have been forgiven. As great a love has been shown to her. But whoever has been forgiven little, loves little. Simon invites Jesus to a meal and then he snubs him. Good manners in that day required the host to have his servants wash the guests' feet. He was expected to greet his visitors with a kiss on the cheek on the left and the right, and then to anoint his head with oil. In those days, the heat of the sun was so hot that the anointing of oil was to cause some of the burning to go away. Simon didn't do any of these things, and by its apparent actions, they were deliberate. He chose not to do this. He would have known what the protocol was. Can you imagine going to a party and then extending your hand or some form of greeting only to have them look at you and go, and not shake back? Jesus looks at Simon and says, he who has been forgiven little loves little. Say that with me. He who has been forgiven little loves little. Now hang on now. Simon was a man who never felt the need for much forgiveness, and therefore he felt little love for those who did. Which meant that even to his own ignorance, in his own self-righteousness, he had little love for God. He thought he loved God with all of his heart, mind, soul, and strength, but the reality was his actions didn't show it at all because he didn't feel that he was needed of much forgiveness. Without a compassion and love for others, Simon neither understood nor loved God. So here's the point. Is that not the same true for us? We who have been forgiven much will have the courage to love much, to risk much. The question for all of us is this: how much have you been forgiven of? Measure your life. Look in the mirror. Go home this afternoon and ask yourself, how much have you been forgiven? Because your actions toward others will reflect it, not in your words, but in your life. Have you been forgiven much, or have you been forgiven little? I would contend that many of us don't think we're that bad. I think that's the problem. I don't think we think we're that bad a sinner. In fact, I don't think most of us don't think we sin at all. They're just little things that Jesus is overlooking. It's not that bad. I'm not that bad. There's lots of bad people out there. Jesus came for the bad people. I'm a good person. And the little bad that I do, he just winks at that. I believe that the single greatest cause of the weakness of our faith and the lack of triumphant liberty in our walk with Christ is that we don't really think we've been forgiven of too much. If we who are Christians don't sense how much God has forgiven us, then not only do we not love Him, but we won't love others. We won't love them the way God wants us to love them. When Simon the Pharisee looked upon this woman, all he saw was a prostitute, a streetwalker, a pitiful excuse as a woman. That's all she was and all she'd ever be, and she's never going to change. Simon looked at her and he goes, I got a tramp in my house. Remember, it was the religious people who said that Jesus was a friend of sinners. They insulted Jesus by lumping him in with those kind of people. Who are those kind of people in your life? The kids that you don't want your kids to play with because you're afraid that those kids are going to rub off on your kids? Hoodlums? Are they drug addicts? Are there those people, the one who stands there with a little cardboard sign that you don't really believe anything that's being said on it as he stands there and says, I'm hungry? And you glibly just move on and turn a left and don't do anything, you actually even disregard it altogether and kind of look away at the lights or look at your text messages until the red goes green again? Who are those kind of people in your world? Foreigners from a different land or people of a different belief who are milking the welfare system, and frankly, you know what? They're just taking our jobs and forcing us to be tolerant. Don't get me wrong here, but I just wonder sometimes if what our society calls tolerance, could it be that Jesus calls it love? I don't know. I only know that Jesus didn't tell us to love sinners. He told us to love people. He told us to love our neighbors. The Pharisees loved little because in their eyes they had little to be forgiven for. Simon's problem was blindness. He did not see himself as the woman. He said she was a sinner, but it was impossible for him to say, I am too a sinner. He did not see him in the same plane as he saw the other woman. Both of them were bankrupt. Both of them could not pay their debt from God. Both of them were in need of a Savior. And both of them, their standard of holiness and righteousness was unacceptable to Christ. It was customary in that day for outsiders to hover around during banquets so that they could watch important people and hear the conversation. So everything was open and everything was being heard that day. The Pharisees invited Jesus to dinner, and this street woman had just shown up, and there she is hanging around crying and whimpering at his feet. How dare she? If Jesus is a prophet, he should have known what kind of woman this is. I find it so amazing that two human beings can have the same encounter in the presence of Christ, and both of them have such different responses. So let's wrap this up. How does the world know that we are followers of Christ? Back in the 70s, we used to sing this song, they will know that we are Christians by our... It is a very dangerous, dangerous thing, folks, to make the mistake of believing that we're not that bad. He who has been forgiven little loves little. He who has been forgiven much loves much. When Jesus looks at you, what does he see? What's your reputation in his eyes? Or are you more concerned about your reputation in their eyes? Do you have the courage to change your reputation? When you look at others, do you see sinners or do you just see people? Do you see the hurting, the wounded, the helpless, and the hopeless? Or do you just see yourself?